we're expecting a high turnout for today's session. So if your friends and colleagues are unable to join us, you can direct them to our Facebook page. And let me just show the link. Yeah, if you want to, refer them to our Facebook page to join us there. But thank you so much for joining us for our September webinar today. I'm Fiona Yong, a research executive at SSR, and you might be watching us live on Zoom or Facebook, or maybe you're watching us at a later date because all of our seminars actually are stored in our videos folder of our Facebook page. So if you do want to access our previous webinars since I think September 2020, you can go head on over there. Yeah, this is the QR code for our Facebook page. Also, this year, January 2021, we actually had a related seminar by the researchers behind the Hunger Report. So that's Dr. Tanya Nagpal and Dr. Dalvin Sidhu. Yeah, so if you do want to check that out, it's very related to this topic as well. Yeah, but as some of you may already know, SSR holds monthly seminars, which have now been converted to online webinars, where we hope to provide a platform for researchers and practitioners and community workers in the social service sector to share their ideas, research findings with the larger community. So we do hope that this providing this platform will spark some interesting discussions and perhaps even further collaboration opportunities. Yeah, today we have with us Dr. Stephanie Chok, who's an independent researcher, and Grace Toh, who's a community worker at Beyond Social Services. And they will be sharing their findings on their qualitative research project titled People Give, Just Take and Eat, Food Insecurity and Food Aid in a Public Rental Neighborhood. So I'll let them introduce themselves later on and also the research project. But before that, a few admin items to go through. And I also have a few QR codes for these admin items. So you might want to whip out your phones because I might go them a bit quickly because we do want to save time for both speakers today. On top of the speakers, we do have Dr. Satveer Kaur-Gill with us as well, who she will be moderating. She is an instructor at Chua Tian Po Community Leadership Center and has done research on food insecurity, particularly on its health impacts on individuals. So we especially invited her because we thought, her work and experience and expertise on this topic would be very, very relevant. Yeah, so you can find us on Facebook. We also did want to announce that the report for this research project is also out on Beyond Social Services website. So we also put the QR code here. You may refer to that. I will also be putting it in the chat later on, a link to the report. Yeah. So we will have some time at the end of today's session, about the last half hour, to do some Q&A. So we do encourage you to submit your questions via Pigeonhole. And you can go on the Pigeonhole to also vote for your favorite questions because those will appear higher on our list and then we can get to those hopefully. And apologies in advance if we cannot answer your questions because we might have a lot of questions coming in, but we will also be opening up the floor in the Zoom room at the end, maybe last 5-10 minutes. So we'll invite you to turn on your mics and cameras if you would like to ask the speakers a question. So we do look forward to the engagement and lively discussion later on. So we do hope you participate. And we also hope you stay on till the end of the seminar because after the Q&A portion, we'll be announcing 2 of our upcoming webinars in October, which are also very exciting. So do stick around for that. And I think this is all I have for admin. And I will now pass my time to the first speaker, who is Dr. Stephanie Chok.
Okay, hi everyone. I guess I should share my screen. Okay. Okay. Let me just sort this out. Okay. Can you see, Kelly? Yeah, can you hear me? Okay, all right. Okay, so hi everyone, I'm Stephanie. As Fiona has said, I'm an independent researcher and I've worked with Beyond on a number of research projects, including this one on food insecurity. So I wanted to thank SSR for the opportunity to present this research. This has been a really meaningful project. I wanted to also give a shout out to the team, the really wonderful team of research volunteers and staff and interns that worked on this project last year, and to all the respondents who shared with us so openly and candidly. And thank you, all of you, for being here this afternoon to listen to this research project. Okay, so a bit of background about the project. Okay, so Grace is going to talk a little bit about the food aid in terms of the numbers, but last year there was a significant and notable increase in food aid during the pandemic in terms of demand for food aid and also donor interest. So donors were quite interested in giving more food aid. We were doing a number of research projects at Beyond related to health and impacts of COVID-19. And even in those projects, it was quite clear that food insecurity was an emerging theme. So we wanted to do a study focusing specifically on food insecurity. What was the nature of food insecurity? How was it manifested? How was it experienced by respondents? And what were their perspectives as people who were receiving food aid? And we wanted to share these findings to inform the community work at Beyond, also to share the findings with donors and other stakeholders involved in food aid. And of course, from an advocacy perspective, to share the findings with the public and also to advocate for some policy changes. So we interviewed 54 residents in a public rental neighborhood. Most of them were in households with at least one child below 18 years old. And this is quite important to point out because the food needs may be quite different from the single and couple elderly who may be living alone. We also did interviews with stakeholders involved in food aid. And then we followed up with a focus group interview with 8 residents. Okay, so what is food insecurity? So first of all, food security, right? The definition of food security is a situation that exists when all people at all times have physical, economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food that meets their dietary needs and food preferences for an active and healthy life. So this is the UN definition. There also needs to be an ability to acquire such food in socially acceptable ways, right? So it's not just the type of food that matters, food that's adequately nutritious to meet health needs. It's also the manner of acquiring such food, right? You need to be able to acquire such food in socially acceptable ways, meaning not scavenging, not stealing, not begging, and not relying on emergency food supplies. Food insecurity, therefore, exists when people do not have a stable access to safe and nutritious foods and are not able to acquire them in socially acceptable ways. Now, in Singapore, the socially acceptable way to acquiring food is to buy it, right? To purchase your groceries at a market or a supermarket to cook, or to buy already prepared food, right? Whether it's a hawker center, a food court, or a restaurant. Okay, so what's the situation in Singapore? So last year, the Lian Center released its hunger report. And in there, it was a nationally representative study. And they found that 10% of the surveyed households experienced food insecurity at least once in the last 12 months. Almost 3.5% experienced severe levels of food insecurity. Food insecure households were more likely to reside in 1 or 2 room flats. Household heads of food insecure families tended to have lower educational attainment. NUS also did a study, and among those who lived in rental flats, they found that about 38% reported they did not have enough food and did not have enough money to get more. 33% worried they would run out of food before they had money to buy more. 15% reported the children were not eating enough because they couldn't afford enough food. And these findings were very closely aligned to findings on financial strain. 33% of those living in public rental flats said they didn't have enough to cover their expenses. 38% had fallen behind in paying their bills. So there's a clear contingent relationship between income poverty and food insecurity. Okay, so in Singapore, you can be hunger-free, but also food insecure, right? So researchers have pointed out that in Singapore, the poor tend to experience intermittent food insecurity and hunger rather than abject poverty and starvation, right? And food insecurity for the poor in Singapore has been described as situations where people only meet the basic requirements of daily intake of food in order to curb their hunger. They need to compromise on the quality of food in favor of eating cheaper options that are unhealthy or inappropriate. So for example, eating a lot of instant noodles. They often need to make difficult decisions between food and other daily needs. And these aptly captures the situation our interviewees described. So if you're in the social service sector in Singapore, you're probably very familiar with the multiple forms of food aid that we have. Most commonly food rations or cooked food. These could be delivered or collected. Some innovations in food aid recently include community fridges or vending machines or community shop. There are also subsidized meals, for example, for school kids on FAS, and of course, supermarket vouchers. So in Singapore last year, it was reported that there were about 125 registered food aid groups. It's not just the number of food aid groups that have increased, it's also the volume and reach of these organizations, right? So Willing Hearts on its website says that it distributes 9,500 meals every single day, 365 days a year to over 40 locations. Food from the Heart, another major food charity, said that it distributed more than $6 million worth of food last year to more than 50,000 people. And on top of all the kind of more well-known registered food aid charities, there are also a lot of non-food charities that give out food aid on a regular or ad hoc basis. So these could be VWOs, religious organizations like churches, schools, and also grassroots organizations. Okay, so now I'm just going to go into the findings proper. Okay, so the findings are divided into findings on food insecurity and then findings on food aid. So with food insecurity, reducing food intake was a key way food insecurity was manifested, and skipping meals was very common, right? Respondents spoke about cooking or eating one at most 2 meals a day. So for example, this respondent says, we skip breakfast, then we skip lunch, then we always eat dinner. Our meal is one meal, one day, one meal only. That's what we can afford. So decision making around food was very much dictated by finances. There was this constant juggling between competing demands. So this interviewee, for example, said, yes, we skip meals because we are more focused on the bills. We let go of the bills first. If we have enough money, then we will go to the market to get food. Parental buffering was very prevalent. So parental buffering refers to situations where parents reduce or compromise their own food intake to protect their children from hunger. So children's needs are always prioritized over their parents, right? So for example, this quote, right? Sometimes when very tight, meaning when finances are very tight, then we let children eat first, then we just drink plain water, lor, it's okay, right? Or this quote, right? Sometimes you will do that for your children. Let's say for that day, we only left 2 to 3 eggs and then I make an omelette. They eat, they ask for more, and I will not have my portion, I will give it to them. There's also a bit of a hierarchy, right? Younger kids get fed first, then the elders, right? So sometimes I cook and that's a little bit. I give my kids first, then my elders, then if got biscuit, we just eat lah, right? So again, we make sure our kids are full first. Everything, our kids come first. Okay, this is a very key and strong message. So how do people cope with food insecurity? So filling up was one strategy, right? Filling up with liquids and snacks and starches. So for example, this respondent, actually he was responding to a question about healthy eating, right? And he said, you know, it's very expensive for us to eat healthily. We just eat starch, a lot of starch, right? Otherwise, how do we keep ourselves full for a long period? So the main thing is to actually get starch so we can keep ourselves full and then we eat lesser meals. Another issue that surfaced was workplace-related food insecurity, right? People who had to eat meals outside the home grappled with food insecurity in different ways. So people sometimes talked about how they wouldn't eat while they were at work. They just tahan, right, until they came home. So this interviewee said, you know, my husband doesn't eat at work, right? He waits till he comes home. But of course, she was concerned and said, you know, you need energy. He says he would drink coffee or he'll fill his tummy with Milo, right? So filling it with liquids. And we need to think about how in Singapore, eating out is framed as something that's easy, that's very cheap and accessible, right? But clearly that's not the case for everybody. So respondents, primarily women, were very frugal. They were very concerned about wastage. They were hyper aware of minute fluctuations in the price of food items. And this created some anxiety during the early stages of the circuit breaker. They were extremely thoughtful about what they bought, when they bought it, where they bought it, when and how they cooked it, including how much oil or gas they used. And sometimes menus were planned right down to the last chicken wing per person per meal. So for example, this interviewee says, I'm not working and we need to stretch what I have. And I have to budget in a way that one person can only take one chicken wing, right? I mean, it's better to have one chicken wing than no chicken wing to eat. So she cooks for 3 households and she budgets and does her grocery shopping in such a way that one person can eat 1 chicken wing for lunch and 1 chicken wing for dinner. Okay, so budgeting involves sometimes buying the cheapest items. So it's not about brand loyalty, it's about buying what is the cheapest, what you can afford. Buying items when they're on sale, so when they're not so fresh. And bargain hunting, you know, shopping around for the cheapest prices. But this was, of course, was not so convenient, sometimes not even possible during the pandemic. So there's a researcher called Megan Blake, okay? She uses this term called thrift acrobatics, and her research respondents on limited budgets spoke about how every purchase is a mental calculation and it is exhausting. And I think what this points out is that we need to rethink this tendency that's very persistent within our welfare system to misdiagnose financial lack for financial incompetence. And we see this a lot in how people in very severe financial hardship are often asked to go for financial literacy classes. But in fact, from our interviewees, it's very clear that they exercise a lot of cognitive power in budgeting to meet their household needs. And they do so on not just limited, but fluctuating amounts. So probably we need to think harder about where the problem lies Maybe it's not budgeting skills per se, but the fact that the budget's not enough. So the issue is about adequacy or inadequacy, right? So difficult trade-offs are made. That's a point that that we've made already. But one of the key compromises is health and nutrition, right? So public health campaigns focus very heavily on increasing awareness about nutrition. And this is to encourage individuals to make healthy choices. And when we ask respondents about this, right, about health considerations when managing their food budgets, we get a mix of responses, right? Amusement, guilt, a lot of guilt, particularly from others, resignation and visible annoyance, right? For example, this quote, right? She said, I don't think about all that. I just open my fridge, I see what I have, and then I cook. I don't have time to think about nutrition because I'm not from a rich family. So there's this sense of I have no choice, right? So a healthy meal is quite expensive. If I don't have money, we always eat egg. I know it's not healthy, but we have no choice. Whatever we can eat for survival, we just eat lah, right? So there's the issue of no choice. There's also the issue of no capacity, right? The bandwidth issue, right? So this interviewee said, when we asked her about whether she worried about the health, the nutritional value of the food she and her children ate, she said, oh, I don't think about this. I'm more worried about my debts, right? Where do I have the capacity to think of this? I'm occupied and stressed up about the rent. Will I still want to worry about this? So we need to be quite mindful about the framing within the public health discourse, which very often obscures the economic realities of people living in poverty, right? Where there are sort of competing financial priorities and the budget is limited to what is affordable and what is available, despite being very aware of what is healthy and what is good, right? So it's not an awareness problem, it's a lack of money problem, right? And when we have very dogmatic messages that emphasize individual choice as a key to improving health, it doesn't actually assist those who are financially disadvantaged from making better, healthier choices. Instead, it fosters a sense of inadequacy and guilt for failing to live up to these standards. And parents, particularly mothers, express a lot of guilt about this, and they're often, very often judged by others for what and how they feed their children. So parents not only feel guilty for not being able to provide their kids healthy meals, they also feel very pressured for not being able to provide treats for their kids, right? And cater to their preferences. So this comes to the very strong social exclusion aspect of food insecurity. So it's very stressful for parents who constantly have to turn down kids' requests, particularly as providing these treats such as an occasional fast food meal is a recognizable and very common social norm in Singapore, particularly among middle-class families, right? So this mother says, you know, when you have kids, they love to eat. So the pressure is there when you can only eat once a day. The kids will be asking, Mommy, why I cannot have nuggets? Why I cannot have fish balls? And I will say, please understand my situation. I don't have enough money. 2 or 3 months later, I'll buy, but it's only enough for that day. So it's quite pressurizing, but she tries to assure her kids that one day they will eat their preferred foods. And parents deal with this pressure in different ways, right? So this mother, she says, my children crave for McDonald's and I sympathize, right? Because it's not frequent. So sometimes she'll borrow money, buy them that fast food meal, and then when she gets the money, she'll return them. So food functions as a marker of social exclusion and inclusion. And in current social contexts, eating the same food as others is a basic mark of belonging. Okay, COVID-19, we cannot not talk about COVID-19, right? So earlier this year, Beyond also released a report called Mind the Chasm, which showed significant drops in household income for those already under financial strain. So yes, we did find that food insecurity was worsened because of the pandemic for a number of persons and increased levels of stress. There was also this triple whammy situation, right? Incomes decreased at a time when schools closed, where people were spending more time at home, so consumption also increased, and there were also fluctuating food prices. So sometimes it's not just that things were wiped out, but it was the cheaper, more affordable items that were not available. And bargain hunting was also not as possible or as convenient. Food shopping was also a lot more stressful, especially for families with young children. So mothers talked about how, you know, they try to avoid grocery shopping because their kids didn't want to wear masks. They were afraid because there were known COVID-19 cases in the area. Some members also relied on family, right, to fulfill food needs. So for example, when they run out of food, they might send their kids to their grandparents' place or their auntie's house, but this was not as convenient or safe during the circuit breaker. Okay, so I'm going to move to findings on food aid. Okay, so food aid is normalized and very common in the neighborhood, and among interviewees, you're all very familiar with charitable food aid, right? So at the community level, when we asked, people all said that, yes, we do need food aid. We will be in trouble without it. So for example, this person said, the people in this area, some of them live meal to meal, right? 有一餐过一餐. Their days are just like this, and it's very difficult to find work. When we asked about adequacy, the general consensus was, no, it's not enough, but it's okay to supplement, right? So food aid is seen as a supplementary source, but it was a very significant supplementary source, okay? It served as a sort of backup supply that can be stored. And I'm talking about dry food rations here, right? So for example, like this quote, she said, you got no money, you still can cook. No money, you got backup, right? You can cook sardines, you got bihun. So food rations, having food rations stocked up at home lessen anxieties about a family completely running out of food. And sometimes being given food means that a certain amount of the household budget can be reallocated. So it sort of functions as some sort of indirect financial assistance. So food aid patterns were generally described as ad hoc and unpredictable, right? So like this person said, I don't know where they came from. I was shocked. Suddenly I got fried bihun, right? And there were times when people talked about it almost akin to some kind of food aid lottery, right? A volunteer knocked on my door, told me I was included in this food ration. I was picked by them, but I don't know why. I was lucky that day. So one of the consequences of this ad hoc pattern, right, is that it made planning ahead very difficult. So this focus group participant who cooks a lot for the family says that we are not sure what time, when exactly, or even what they will receive. So as the breadwinner, he still has to put aside a certain amount of food, right? So a certain amount of the budget or the money to purchase groceries to cook. And then sometimes suddenly they'll find themselves with a lot of the same thing, right? So we talked about how sometimes he can end up with like 10 to 12 tins of sardine. So it's not only is the frequency of food aid variable, so is the quality of food aid. Now with cooked food, the main advantage is that it saves time and it saves money. But in terms of food aid, I must say most of the complaints that were received centered around cooked food, right? But although interviews shared their feedback, they were quite reluctant to share this feedback with the donor agencies, right? So for example, this respondent said, the first time the cooked food came, it was not nice. My children didn't want to eat because they say no taste. Second time was okay, but not every day. So you must see the day, right? Sometimes nice, sometimes not nice. It depends. But we cannot be fussy, right? We have to eat. And it's not just beneficiaries that have commented on the quality of some of the cooked food. Stakeholders have also talked about this. So the stakeholder, for example, said that, he'd noticed donors coming in to provide food. The food that's being served, it is just terrible. Sometimes it looks like swill. And you don't know what time they come, sometimes 9 or 10, sometimes 1 o'clock. And it's sad to see beneficiaries eating like that. It's like bo pian, ai jia, ai tun, which in English means no choice, must eat, must swallow, right? And the unpredictability in terms of the timing has food safety implications, right? So some respondents have talked about how by the time they want to eat the cooked food, it's already spoiled. Okay. So adults sometimes adopt the just tahan and eat attitude, right? But it's a lot more challenging when it comes to kids. So this mother said that, the kids will be like, yeah, so what's this? Tastes like hospital food. And then she tries to cajole them, right? She says, it's healthy, there's no poison, just try and eat it, right? She tries to explain, this is a hard time for us, we just have to eat it, just tahan and eat, right? But this parent said that, there's a limit to how much you can force children to eat food they don't want to eat. So she said they might eat at the start, but after a while they won't, and it becomes a waste of food. How do you force them if they don't want to eat? So there's a lot of excess and unwanted unsuitable food aid, and residents devise a lot of strategies for dealing with this, right? So there's a very active redistribution network among the neighborhood where they kind of whatever food rations they have too much of or they don't use, they will pass around, and also for cooked food, right? So for food rations, they give to neighbors, friends, colleagues. So this person who really doesn't like baked beans, I made it very clear he didn't like baked beans, right? So he says, I don't like baked beans. I really don't like baked beans. So you're giving me more baked beans, right? But he concedes that you have to see the majority. He doesn't expect donors to change. He just says that, worst come to worst, if I don't like baked beans, I give it to someone else, right? But he's very sort of mindful of the fact that you don't throw rations away. For cooked food, one thing that some respondents did was they re-season or they modify the cooked food, right? So sometimes the food comes, it's not nice, so she cooked back, right? She puts in seasoning like chicken stock, she cuts onions and eggs, she mixes it with oyster sauce or ketchup to make it nicer. If you throw away, it's very wasted. But sometimes, of course, this is limited depending on how much the gravy is mixed with the rice and all that. Yeah. But there are, of course, limits to redistribution. Invariably, there is wastage. And wastage is a huge concern, right? Not just for residents, but also for stakeholders. And media reports talk a lot about wastage, which is linked to inappropriate provisions, right? In terms of quality and quantity. And sometimes it's just too much, despite efforts by residents to avoid wastage, right? So for example, this interviewee said, sometimes she tries to give the food to the neighbors and then they say, oh, but we already cooked, right? And she says that there's just too much. In my household, we have 3 people and they give us 6 or 7 packets. How are we going to finish? Also, receiver-giver relations are very unclear. So we said, why don't you just tell them you don't want it? She said, I can't. When I open the door, the food's already hanging there, right? And she says she's noted that some neighbors actually stick a note on the gate to say, don't send me any more food, right? So it's very common, like when we spoke to residents and they say, actually, I don't really know where this food is from or who gave it to me, right? There's no direct channel between them and the person giving the food. So there's a very discernible ambivalence towards food aid. There was gratitude mixed with frustration and resignation, but there was also this very dominant narrative of not wanting to be seen as fussy, right? So this interview said, I'm not trying to complain, but when you see the cooked food, you just don't want to eat. And when I talk about it, I feel sad because the food was very bad and I know my children didn't like it, but no choice. But she says, people give, we just eat. We cannot complain. And then we ask you, have you given feedback? And he says, no, we cannot. It's not nice for us to complain. This is free food. So it's this sense that it's very rude to say, very rude to refuse when people give you food. They're doing this out of the kindness of their heart, right? There's also the issue of low expectations, right? So for example, if it's edible, if I don't die, I'll still eat it, okay? And then the concern of being cancelled. You give feedback and then next time maybe they want to give me any more, right? And sometimes there's a perception that you give feedback also no use, right? So this lady said she did try to give feedback, but when she told the person who was hanging the food on the door, he said, I'm just a delivery person, even if you tell me I can't do anything about it, right? So what are some suggestions and concerns for improving food aid? So one thing that we noted was that among some respondents, there were perceptions of preferential treatment. So this came up when they said, oh, I suggest that food distribution should be fair, right? So distributions were seen sometimes as biased, that certain families or certain blocks were believed to receive more food. And because need is widespread, right? So it's not fair because everyone needs food and everyone should be given food. And this speculation is fueled by a general confusion over food aid mechanisms and back-end decision-making processes, right? So for example, one interview, we started wondering, oh, is it because, I'm not on good terms with this person or that person? Is that why I don't get food anymore? So everyone generally accepted that, food aid was driven by a donor-dependent model, and they didn't really have misgivings about that. But at the same time, this imposed scarcity, right? When you have, say, 100 hampers or $1,000 worth of vouchers and like 6 blocks of families, what do you do, right? It can create animosity and tension within the community. And volunteers and staff are the ones who have to kind of deal with the strain of this, right? So when we had a focus group, some of the participants who used to be involved in food aid distributions talked about how they had to manage the displeasure of people who were turned away. So if one block gets, another block doesn't get, they will ask, they'll get upset. The elderly will ask if the young families get, younger families will ask if the elderly gets, right? So their suggestion was to have some sort of rotation system with a schedule that was sort of, so residents were briefed so that they kind of know that eventually I will get a turn even if I don't get now, right? Another preference, a very strong preference was expressed for supermarket vouchers. So this was in relation to wastage, right? So supermarket vouchers offer greater autonomy. It allows you to choose what you need and what you prefer. You can buy it when you need it, and there's also less wastage. Oops. Why can't I? Okay. So we ended our interviews by asking people about their food memories, right? And invariably, there was a very strong narrative of survival. One interviewee, when asked to recount his food memories, said food does not bring up any positive memories or experiences. It's merely a means of survival. And for some of them, it's because there's this backdrop of cumulative hardship. So she said that she appreciates any food because there was once many years back when she had no food at all, and she had to dig up rubbish to eat food. But of course, as we continue to prod, right, eventually, people started to give a bit more varied responses. And of course, we know that food does have strong social and cultural significance, right? So one member said, oh, it really stressed, right? So when I eat, I enjoy it, I don't think about other things. And it's a means of showing care and bonding. So one member talked about how you show care, you show love. When people have less, you can give, right? It felt good to be able to bless others. And she talked about having barbecues and parties and having fun, sharing food and bonding over food. Another respondent talked about Mid-Autumn Festival. Some talked about birthdays or Christmas. And then this member said, no matter what I'm eating with my mother is the happiest for me. Another member said that no food equals unhappiness, therefore any food equals happiness. So having no food in the house creates a lot of tension, right? When you open the fridge and there's no food, it will make someone angry. The person will come back home and it'll be like, there's no food on the table and I have to eat biscuits. So for her, food is happiness. You just need to have food in the home. Okay. One thing that was quite stark for me was that, food advertising, you talk about food porn, for example, right? It's all about pleasure and joy, the joys of eating. And we do live in a very food obsessed nation. But very few quotes talked about the pleasures or joys of eating at all, except for this one, right? So this lady was like kind of waxing lyrical about this kueh that she received, right? So she said, long time never eat the kueh, the Malay kueh. And then one time got a donation. They gave me one time only. My heart, oh my God, long time never get the taste of this. I got the taste of putri salad. It's like at last, right? Because I envy the taste of kueh for a long time and I'm so lucky I got one. Then my son asked, Mommy, why are you so happy you get this kueh? And then I said, a long time never eat this kueh. Right. So this was quite poignant for me because it was one of the few quotes that actually sort of invoked the pleasures of eating. Okay, so I'm moving into the last section, right? Okay, so a question that's increasingly being asked in discourse about charitable food aid, particularly in wealthy countries, is whether or not it's a practical, effective, and ethical response to hunger and poverty, right? Food aid charities play a very key role in managing, but not necessarily reducing the consequences of poverty. And Elizabeth Dowler, who writes a lot about food insecurity, she sort of points out that charitable agents are trapped, right, in this dilemma where they are seeking to support and empower the marginalized, but they're also acting as proxy deliverers of state services. They depend on uncertain funding and they face increasing logistical tasks, right, of securing and training volunteers and appropriately sourcing and managing food stocks, and then having to deliver them safely. Logistically, it is a very massive task, right? And it's very much volunteer driven and donor dependent. So some of the other issues with food aid that have been pointed out are adequacy, right? It's a limited and inadequate strategy. Provisions are often too small or too piecemeal to meet systemic need. It's stigmatizing, right? There are uneven poverty relations embedded in charitable food aid, right? It's a very distinctly other system of food acquisition, right? And Dowler asks, why should some people not be able to shop for food like everyone else? It's depoliticizing, it's a downstream response, it focuses on individual responses rather than structural drivers, and food aid organizations allow states to outsource or obscure their responsibilities. Food aid charities, I must point out, should not be held responsible for statutory neglect. Okay, the needs that food aid charities meet are urgent and they're necessary. Food aid charities can also be sites of caring and social solidarity, and many extend care in other ways beyond food and nurture relationships that are very important to local communities, right? At the same time, right, this is the big but, critical questions need to be asked about the longer term role of charities in meeting the challenges of food insecurity, right? What are some of the social and political contributions that they can make to advance progressive responses to food insecurity and income poverty? Okay, so what is a right-based approach to food? Okay, so the UN has a special rapporteur on the right to food, and he says when people come to depend on charity for basic foodstuffs, it's a signal that their right to food has not been sufficiently respected, protected, and fulfilled. So the UN has an international convention on economic, social, and cultural rights, which Singapore is not a signatory of, and it points out that everyone has a right to an adequate standard of living, including adequate food, clothing, housing, and continuous improvement of living conditions, right? And states have an obligation to protect, respect, and fulfill the rights to food. What does this involve? It involves political commitments by states to ensure that their policies promote access to adequate food. This includes employment opportunities, ensuring a living wage, adequate benefits, affordable housing, universal childcare, social protection, right? In advocating for human rights approach, it helps to reorient us towards addressing social determinants of food insecurity, right? So things like regulation of labor conditions, enhancing social protection. In other words, we need to think about some of the structural determinants and therefore what are the structural interventions that are necessary. Okay, concluding remarks. Okay, so food insecurity is closely linked to economic inequality. There is ambivalence expressed towards food aid. There's a lot of gratitude, but it's mixed with shame, resignation, and some frustration. Charitable food aid is not to be blamed for statutory neglect. However, charities should adopt a more reflexive stance and consider their contributions, particularly socially and politically. Food insecurity is an issue of both social and ecological justice and requires moral, legal, and political action. So Elizabeth Dowler does talk about this when she talks about affordable, sustainable food, right? So one of the solutions that people have suggested is just to make food cheaper. But cheaper food has other costs, right? It exerts a downward pressure on wages within the food system. There are also a lot of environmentally unfriendly practices. So we need to be mindful of that as well. Finally, if we recognize the human right to food, that access to adequate, nutritious, safe food acquired in socially acceptable ways, if we recognize that as a human right, this access should not be treated as a gift or an act of benevolence. It should be recognized as a fundamental right and a statutory obligation. Okay, so I've come to the end of my presentation. So here is the link to the report. But it's probably too long for you to remember. You can just go onto Beyond's website, Beyond's research website, and you can download the report. Or you can email me. That's my email address if you want to ask any questions about the report. Okay, so I'm done with my presentation, and I'm going to hand over now to Grace Toh from Beyond, who will talk about local response.
Hi. Hi, can everyone see?
Yes, I can.
Okay, hello everyone. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to share with you about what we do at Beyond. So I'm just going to jump straight into the presentation. So as Steph has shared, the food needs last year was unprecedented. So we had to find the resources and the volunteers very quickly to meet these needs. So today I will share about Beyond's approach, which is really about strengthening local response. And the outcome of this approach is local leadership and ownership. So, okay, very quickly about Beyond Social Services. Beyond is a community development agency and is dedicated to supporting low-income families living in public rental flats to lead purposeful and meaningful lives. And our vision is to create neighborhoods where every individual has an active role to play and is able to cooperate with and support each other. So we lead a community development agency process within public rental housing neighborhoods that empowers individuals, families, and their communities to own and act on their social challenges. So we use the asset-based approach with that focus on strengths. Now, what do I mean by strengths? When we are in a community, for example, we will look out for that father who wants to organize a soccer clinic or to engage the community kids, or we look out for that mother who is very good in cooking and is happy to prepare meals for families who are struggling, or we look out for that auntie or the uncle who wants to help out in the food distribution. So some of the questions that we ask are, what skills or strengths or interests does this member or family have or want? What already exists in their community, and what would they like to see happen in their community? So we also try to find out, what are the networks that the family or the member can tap on. So we ask them, oh, who do you turn to in your community? And who can you invite to participate in the community efforts? So these above questions do allow us to understand more about the community and appreciate them and their efforts. So we encourage the residents, who we call the community members, to come together to determine the support they need and to take action on what's important for them. We provide that resources, that support that really act as platforms for the community to come together to build relationships. So through this community development approach, the relationships between the residents are strengthened, as illustrated through this diagram. Okay, so I just want to share that this is the volume of the food aid that we gave out last year. So in terms of cooked meals, it's 96,000. And in terms of food ration packs, it's 5,300. In terms of supermarket vouchers, is $818,000 worth of supermarket vouchers. So when COVID hit Singapore, many of our families lost jobs and income. The need for food aid was really much higher than before. So we are not a food agency, but thankfully we received this generous outpour of food donations that you just saw through the numbers here. And they were distributed to more than 1,500 families living in 64 rental blocks across 20 neighborhoods. So I'd like to share my learning journey here. Last year, my main role was to ensure that the process of channeling this food aid from the donors to the families was efficient. So the needs were many and they were pressing. And there was a huge volume of coordination work that needs to be done between the donors, the community, and the volunteers. And to ensure timely assistance to the families, it was really quite overwhelming for the team at Beyond. So initially, we received many cooked meals. They were welcomed by the families, but after receiving cooked meals, cooked in the same style again and again, we received feedback from the families that they like to cook their own recipes as well. So we began to request from donors for food ration packs. And since food prices increased and more members were eating at home because of the circuit breaker or the HBL, we also increased our request from $50 to $80 per pack. Then we realized that this $80 pack was very heavy. It was very extremely difficult to distribute. It took us longer time than usual, and there was limited manpower that was allowed on the ground. So we began to ask for supermarket vouchers. Also, at the same time, the families request for supermarket vouchers because they can buy things like fresh food or items that are not normally found in the food ration pack, like milk and diapers. So and also for vouchers for us are logistically easier to distribute. So we began to ask for vouchers, and thankfully the donors responded positively. So when it comes to mobilizing local response, who is part of this local response? They are the residents who step forward to volunteer. And some of these community volunteers, they just begin to participate more actively. They engage their neighbors in conversations like at the lift, along the corridor, or at the market. And they make very intentional efforts to reach out or to watch out for their neighbors' welfare. So also they are more active in organizing community events and rallying their neighbors to help out. So we call them neighborhood leaders. Now, before COVID, Beyond already has relationships with these community volunteers and neighborhood leaders for a number of years. And when COVID happened, we tapped on these relationships and we worked with them to mobilize that local response in their communities so that the many distributions can be carried out. Now, why is it good to mobilize local response? We believe that this group of residents can actively participate and contribute to the community they live in. And in the process, they can be empowered, and it develops that sense of agency and ownership. And we also work with them to nurture that culture of mutual help within the community because it builds relationships and it widens the residents' social networks. And with the, in so doing, we hope that the residents, the community members can develop that sense of belonging and that neighborhood pride. So, I just like to mention here, at this point, I'd like to share this experience with you. So during the circuit breaker last year, the number of volunteers from the wider community reduced drastically. So as there were restrictions on movements, right? So we mobilized the neighborhood leaders that we already know to help with the food distributions. And they in turn rallied their neighbors to help out. And this trend of residents coming forward to express their interest in helping was across the neighborhoods under our care. So they told us that it is very important to take care of the vulnerable families among us. And I have to say that we wouldn't have been able to channel this huge volume of food aid to the families in a timely manner if not for these local response. And they organize the distributions. So we really, really appreciate them. So initially, the residents, they stepped forward because they either lost jobs or they didn't have much to do during the circuit breaker. And as they participate, the valuable thing was that they began to form friendships and they began to watch out for each other. And even after the circuit breaker, some of these volunteers, they found jobs, but they would still find time to help out when they're not working. And over time, they get to know their neighbors and their children better. And this goes both ways. So to a child or family, the auntie or uncle who gives me a food pack is no longer just another face along the corridor, but a caring neighbor. And we over time we also witness the recipients trying to contribute in meaningful ways, and they cook and then they share food with the volunteers, or they help to receive delivery for other neighbors who are not at home. And these friendships that started during the crisis will no doubt continue to thrive after the crisis. So I just want to share with you how local response was mobilized. An important aspect of our work is involving the community in the decision-making process. They participate and they get to decide. So for example, we ask them, hey, what kind of food rations do you want? So as a community, they will discuss, and mostly over WhatsApp, on what the majority prefers. So sometimes, even though the items are very straightforward, like rice, oil, Milo, but we feel that it is important that they voice out. So when it comes to cooked meals, we also do get them to purchase from the nearby food centers. So that way they choose the menu. And at times, they also contribute ideas to reduce duplication or wastage. Like they will tell us, oh, they don't prefer certain food because they don't use it so much in their cooking. Like, for example, baked beans, or they will share food that they seldom use with their neighbors, like, a canned mushroom or pasta. So, being neighborhood leaders, they have very large networks within the communities. Very often they go door knocking to understand families' needs. So they know who has moved out and they approach new families who have just moved in. They take the initiative to engage in conversations with families who seem to be struggling, and they will rally the neighbors to come and help out families who are in crisis. So as a result, they know their families or their neighborhoods very well. And in turn, the families also look towards them like village chiefs, and approach them for help or seek opinions. But when you ask them, hey, how do you feel about being a leader in your neighborhood? Then they'll say, no lah, we're just helping, or we just like to help. So as community workers, we work with these local leaders very closely to identify the families that need support and resources. So when resources are limited, then they will guide us in prioritizing the vulnerable families and ensure that the families who are not on the list this time to get the next batch of resources. So we regard these local leaders as very special, like they are like the center that holds the neighborhood together. Now, we believe that it is important to support the neighborhood leaders so that they can take charge of the distributions successfully. So during COVID period, this support came in the form of relevant information like updated safety measures, or relevant resources like safety gear, sanitizers, thermometers, so that the activities can be carried out safely. And during the distributions, the volunteers have to carry a lot of heavy items. So we also support them with trolleys and carrier bags. Now, when it comes to organizing the logistics, they are the experts. They will tell us, oh, where should the groceries be unloaded, how to pack the groceries, or when is the best time to distribute. So we listen to them. We also organize sharing sessions between leaders from different communities. So for example, in a volunteer appreciation session, some neighborhood leaders will share about their challenges and their struggles, and in turn, other leaders will affirm them and share their wisdom. So in another instance, some local leaders will wanted to bring in food rescue initiatives into their neighborhood, and we arrange for them to consult another neighborhood who is already doing so. So, and also other examples are, in some neighborhoods, the more experienced leader will bring along the newer leaders to tag along, and when they go door knocking, very similar to like on the job training. And I would like to share with you more about Project Masala. So this Project Masala, which is translated Let's Cook, This project achieves two objectives: supporting food insecure families and nurturing home-based community cooks. So in the process of identifying strengths in the community, we found mothers who can cook very well, and we supported them by sending them to obtain the necessary food safety and hygiene certs. And at the same time, we also work with the local response to identify food insecure families. So the outcome is that this group of cooks are able to actively participate in the food needs in their community. And the cooks also get to decide on a menu as they understand their neighbors' culture and preferences. There is some form of regularity. Okay, the cooks will prepare two meals 2 times a week over a few months. And really what is very precious is that relationship building between the cooks and the families. So each cook is connected to a small group of about 10 families over WhatsApp. They talk about menu, like preferred taste, they give feedback or encouragement. And what it translated over time is very heartwarming because they begin to make friends with each other. Okay, the other thing is that we raise funds to pay the cooks $6 a meal. So the cooks will cost in the ingredients and utilities and they earn the balance. This income is especially important during such difficult times. And another valuable outcome was this community cooks club that my colleagues has formed. And the club becomes a support group for the cooks. So they attend training sessions together, they share experiences and recipes. So I realized my time is up, so sorry, I just overran a bit. I'd like to end by saying that food insecurity is still prevalent in the low-income neighborhoods, and we have to address these needs so that family functionality can continue. So we are currently running Jiapa Bui, which translates to Have You Eaten? It's a food and essentials fundraiser to support families struggling with their food needs. And I'm sharing here the links to the fundraiser. And if you have any questions, please email me at grace@beyond.org.sg. We are also on Instagram and Facebook, and that's our website address there. Thank you.
All right, can everybody hear me?
Sorry, I was on mute. Yes, I can hear you, Satveer.
All right, great. All right, thank you very much, Stephanie and Grace, for the very urgent and thought-provoking discussion on food insecurity during the COVID-19 crisis. Just to sort of begin and provide a very short summary of some of the key points from the presentations. Stephanie's presentation gave us rich and deep insight into the phenomenon of food insecurity, sharing with us the narratives of how food insecurity is lived and experienced. Some of the most important examples highlighted include sharing meals, storing and delaying meals, and the complex decision-making around food. Grace's presentation highlighted how community development approaches, such as the asset-based approach, creates opportunities for sustainable and resilient communities to come together to overcome food insecurity impactfully. The intersections of both your presentations show us how the praxis of community development is deeply shaped by in-depth research that centers community voice and solutioning, highlighting richly the narratives of communities living through social crisis. Only by listening to their lived experiences closely can we understand the meanings of food insecurity and how these experiences are navigated on a daily basis and how communities are already actually solutioning around these challenges. The big question I kind of want to start off with, especially with such rich insight on the findings and Grace's presentations on communities as assets in working through food insecurity, is the ways in which your presentations sort of indicated or highlighted in some way the toppling of the dependency narrative as the only solution. In Stephanie's presentation, narratives discussing taking food because it is donated and therefore one cannot complain, the idea that food donation or donor-driven food aid as a solution, and sometimes clearly welcomed by participants, can also be problematic because it results in stigmatizing the food insecure, creating a context of shame and dependency around food access. Food should be a fundamental right. It also prioritizes personal generosity, distracting from really focusing on the economic and social disruptions that causes these inequalities to food access and can often be inefficient. So maybe we can start off with Grace. So how do you think community development efforts, such as adopting an ABCD approach, moves away from stigmatizing the food insecure and includes and empowers communities in the solutioning process. What were some of your reflections?
Okay, so ABCD, or community development, recognizes that strengths in people and recognizes that recipients have that have gifts and assets to contribute back. It also recognizes that through community efforts, the connections between members are strengthened. So other than the local community, even the wider community, like partners, stakeholders, volunteers, they are also donors, especially. They are also assets, and everyone can participate in this, in the efforts of the local community. And in so doing, the community has more resources, right? And so importantly, we need to recognize that because we believe that recipients have that strengths and that gifts, they are able to contribute back. They have their life experiences, they have their knowledge, wisdom, and they volunteer as well. So, and all these are empowering and, are able to help them, not say help, but are able to perhaps address some of the narratives and help shift certain narratives away from more stigmatizing perspectives. And I think importantly, we need to be mindful that the importance of maintaining that dignity of the receiver. That's something that I took away. Families, even though families are on the receiving end, it doesn't mean that things need to be decided for them. So in giving this decision-making power to the community, like what I mentioned just now, it perhaps can also shift that narrative and also that perspective that's of that stigmatizing perspective that of them being dependent on food aid.
Thank you, Grace. Stephanie, you too have experience with CDs, so I hope you are able to share with us your experiences as well.
Yeah, so here comes the big but, right? Again, I'm going to go back to Megan Blake. So Megan Blake is a researcher that writes about food insecurity in the UK, and she talks about this food ladders framework, right? And how in communities that have been hollowed out by financial and social disadvantage, there are organizations she studied that did use a ABCD approach, and they try to sort of encourage positive engagements through food. And they tried to ensure reciprocity. So a lot of things that Grace mentioned were very familiar, right? And she showed that there were a lot of very concrete improvements. So thoughtful community-based activity can definitely strengthen social capital, right? And I think this is very important to point out in the Singapore context, right? Policy that emphasizes self-organizing as the whole solution to food insecurity imposes unreasonable expectations on individuals and communities that have been hollowed out by welfare reforms. So Megan Blake, who advocates ABCD approaches, also issues a caution, right? She says that self-organization at the community scale takes a very long time to reach its transformative potential. And we live in a country where this kind of self-organizing is valorized, even fetishized, right? Like this community resilience rhetoric, right? And she talks about how we need to think about what are the policies that impose additional stresses on these fragile infrastructures, what undermines them, right? And while we advocate community self-organization, and we try our best to enable community resilience, we must be careful not to impose the privilege of affluent populations onto deprived populations and then castigate them for their failures. So I just wanted to kind of offer that alternative position as well, even though ABCD approaches are very important. Yeah.
That was very, very informative and absolutely right. How it sort of moves into a space where asset-based approaches can often also become an approach that can, again, cause greater stigmatization as well if it's not done in a way that really activates the communities or really sort of treads on their agency. This leads to sort of the second question, and I think it sort of is also the gist of many of the questions that were asked. food aid is often intermittent and unpredictable. There was a lot of narratives describing that there is an intermittentness to food aid. It is not sustainable, or it can be not sustainable and can sometimes be inefficient. Furthermore, it limits the agency of the individuals to make choices about their food. In one of your presentations, there was a description about the food aid lottery, thus moving us to think about then the role of the broader unjust food systems, right? So second question that I had for both of the presenters were their thoughts on the role of the food system or the broader structures that create unjust food patterns. And can the presenters share a bit more about how you envision food justice in the context of uneven food access structurally? A very similar question, ideally, what would food as a right look like in Singapore? Assuming no changes in income disparity, food vouchers from the government, food security agency, central coordination of health. Those were some of the examples in the question.
Satveer, do you mean that all things remaining equal?
I'll just sort of repeat the question, or maybe we could sort of just talk about how can, maybe both of you can talk about how you envision food justice in the context of uneven food access structurally.
Well, for me, food justice means even access, right? How can you have food justice when there's uneven access, when there's income inequality, when there's economic inequality, when there's health inequalities, right? So I don't think it's possible to envision food justice and then also say at the same time, let's just imagine that inequality is the status quo and we're not going to do anything about it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Grace, do you have anything that you want to say? Grace, you're on mute.
So like what Steph said, food justice is like social justice, and that means everyone must have enough. Then there must be efforts, at higher levels to equalize society. So yeah, I'm so sorry, I don't have the answers down here. Yeah.
I guess if you think about maybe things in the short, medium, and long term, then maybe that can help to kind of think about how to move things in a certain direction for a start. I guess in the short term, if we recognize that you cannot actually do away with that dependency immediately, so you kind of have to kind of allow for longer term interventions that deal with the structural issues. But in the shorter terms, I guess it would be just listening to what food aid recipients are saying. And right now for families that cook, the preference is very clear: supermarket vouchers, so I can choose what I need, buy what I need when I need it. So there needs to be more trust from donors, right? So the relationships between donors, donor agencies, and people receiving food aid. I think in the medium to long term, it would be moving away from food aid that is just really too cumbersome and not popular, like cooked food. There's no reason to have to, over the long term, be giving people cooked food if they have the time to cook, the money to cook, the resources to cook according to their own needs, right? So if you think about sort of what can be done in the shorter term, which is to kind of improve the quantity, quality, and stability of food aid, that would be a great improvement. And then in the medium to long term, I would say look at the structural interventions that are required so that in the longer term, people won't have to be dependent on food aid. Yeah.
Thank you, Stephanie. The other questions included questions about method, for example. So how were the research participants selected in terms of recruiting and getting them to participate in the research? Also, which were the public rental estates in which the study was conducted?
Beyond works in a number of neighborhoods, and we specifically chose not to name the neighborhood in the report. The people who participated in the research were members, so basically they were known to Beyond. They'd been people who generally is already on Beyond's database. So we reached out, and whoever agreed to be interviewed, we focus mainly on families with children. So among the sample, we sort of didn't want to kind of we wanted to be able to understand the situation specifically for families with children. So we chose people within that sample group.
Thank you, Stephanie. Another question was, again, a method question, was are there profile of respondents that you hope to interview but didn't manage to do so? And are these profiles expected to have different needs and perspectives?
So I actually read when I was doing the literature review, I read some really interesting research involving youth, right? So in the UK, for example, they did a study which interviewed young persons, and they talked about very poignantly about the social exclusion aspects of being food insecure, how on the way home from school, their peers would stop and buy snacks and they couldn't. Then they would just watch, or they feel ashamed not being able to invite their friends over for a meal or to play because or to hang out because there's no food in the cupboards, or when their neighborhoods were getting increasingly gentrified, and then on the way home, the kids would stop and buy a panini sandwich, and then they just hang back, and then maybe a friend would just halve off a bit and give them to eat. And they talked a lot about the sense of shame. And I just thought it would be interesting to kind of understand what the sort of teenagers, how they dealt with food insecurity. But I mean, of course, ethics-wise, it's much more complicated to interview people below the age of 18, right, or 21. And secondly, because we had limited time and resources, we only managed to interview sort of parents, right? So that's why there was that focus on parental buffering. But I do think it'd be interesting to interview youth, for example. Yeah.
Some of the questions also wanted to understand if participants talked about fresh food aid, fruits and vegetables. Do you have any thoughts on this?
Sorry, Grace, do you want to say something about fresh fruit and vegetables?
Yeah, hang on. So yes, definitely, we recognize, and even some of the donors recognize the importance of fresh food in the diet of the recipients. And initially, they thought that the cooked meals can provide that so-called fresh food, right? Then it's really a learning journey for everyone. I mean, for me and beyond. So and that's when the supermarket vouchers are very empowering, because they really allow them to buy some form of fresh food in the supermarkets. And I also mentioned about the Project Masaklah just now, and that was also enabled the families to have some form of fresh, and not only fresh but nutritious and regular food as well. So yes, definitely that is very much in the consideration of how we administer food aid, and in our advocacy to the donors who want to contribute to food aid.
Yeah, so in our focus group, there was a lot of interest in getting more fresh food. So fresh produce, whether it's fresh meat, vegetables and fruit, because these are expensive items. Frozen fruit is frozen food, except for frozen fruit. Frozen food is always cheaper than fresh meat, for example. The only issue would be that logistically it's a lot more difficult and expensive, right? So, but definitely there's a demand for fruit, vegetables and fresh meat.
A question about food insecurity as a phenomenon. Has the problem grown more severe over the years, even without COVID? And in terms of the changes in general public perception, is there lesser stigma and greater awareness, for example? Yeah.
Our research doesn't track prevalence in the same way that the Lien Center report did, in terms of 10%. So, there isn't this kind of longitudinal perspective in terms of the scale of prevalence. But I would say that in terms of the COVID impact, COVID has exacerbated issues. But I say this from not just this research, but other research we are doing. COVID cannot be blamed for the financial hardships people are in, right? All the structural drivers have existed prior to COVID, and people were already in very precarious situations prior to the pandemic. Yeah.
Grace, did you have anything to add to that, or?
Sorry, can you repeat your question again? Sorry.
I think the question was generally about has the phenomenon of food insecurity grown over the years?
Okay, I mean, definitely the impact of COVID has a worsening effect, and I have to say that I mean, as Steph's report has shown, that food insecurity is tied very closely to income poverty, and when COVID hit, many of them lost jobs, right? So that has made the situation even worse, and many of them, I mean, yes, when we went to phase 3, many of them, not many, but some of them, they found jobs, and some of them have grown financially stronger. But we do understand that many of them still are, struggling with ad hoc jobs, living hand to mouth. And the recent heightened alert, not so recent anymore, but has just, thrown everybody off guard again. And the kind of jobs that they are in, like gig economy, private hire, are really the ones that gets impacted really hard. And not only that, they face competition because people who are laid off from industries like aviation and tourism, they go into these sectors to try and ride out the pandemic. So, what I'm trying to say is that because of such dire circumstances, yes, I think food insecurity has been on the rise.
Thank you, Grace. The next set of questions talk a bit more about advocacy. So the question is about how would you suggest we could consider advocating in this area of food insecurity? How could we communicate this to government bodies? And the other question is, how can food charities do more in terms of social and political interventions?
Grace, you want to go first?
Okay, I will just take the question of what can we do as a as a charity. I think at our level. Okay, firstly, I mean, sorry, I'm not going to talk about the political or social levels, right? So the immediate stakeholders that me and my team interact with on a day-to-day basis are the donors, the volunteers, and other community partners like other other charities. So it is really advocating the beliefs that we have that I mentioned in presentation just now, and again, is that these members, even though they are recipients, they have something to contribute back as well, and we always endeavor to find platforms whereby the recipients can, or rather the community members can contribute to the external community or the wider society in ways. So it can be very simple things like, when they, okay, that was before COVID, but can be very simple ways like, they cook and then they share the food with the neighbors, and then they contribute in terms of, managing and running the food distributions. All these are the efforts that they are trying to give back to the community, and I'm sure, when the situation stabilizes, and there can be many more opportunities they can give back as well. So, for example, when we have, outings, or picnics with some of the donors or sponsors, they come with food that they cook, and generally they cook very well. So, and they contribute that to the picnic or, or whatever event that we have organized. Yeah, so and we constantly try to advocate this to our partners.
Casey, your question was about advocacy and policy, is it, Satveer?
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, so first disclaimer, then response, right? Okay, so disclaimer, I speak as an independent researcher. I do not reflect the views of any organizations I work with. So if anybody takes issue with what I say, come look for me. Don't look for my ex-boss, don't look for my future boss, don't look for people I work with, don't look for people who pay for my work, come look for me. Okay, these are my personal opinions. Okay, so in terms of social and political advocacy, I guess I would go back to my concluding slides. If we recognize food as a human right, and we think about the International Convention on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, then we recognize, right, that there's this close contingent relationship between food insecurity and wage inequality and social protection. So if the relationship is clear, then the structural interventions also point us in a certain direction, right? So if it's, especially in the kind of wealthy urban country context, actually what we're talking about is not food insecurity, we're talking about food poverty. People not being able to have economic access to food. Elizabeth Dowler asked a very simple question. Why is it that we accept that some people just can't go to the supermarket to buy food, and we expect that we just keep piling more food aid on people, right? I'm not knocking food aid, right? I think it's important. I'm not suggesting that when somebody hungry comes up to you, you stand there and pontificate about the structural determinants of food poverty and don't feed them, right? That would be a very asshole thing to do. But in the long term, as a very wealthy, advanced country, right, who has expressed a view that we are concerned about social protection, that we need to do something about all those things that have been pointed out by the Special Rapporteur for the right to food, right? A political commitment by the state to ensure policies promote access to adequate food, employment opportunities, ensuring a living wage, adequate benefits, affordable housing, universal childcare, social protection. What is provided in our social protection infrastructure? And I think the issue of adequacy comes up, right? If, for example, people are unable to work, so if they are working, they should be paid a living wage. If they are unable to work, what are they living on? And is what they're living on adequate enough to enable them to live a life that takes care of their well-being, including food security? So I'm not convinced at the moment that those benchmarks are adequate. And I think that they really need to be looked into, because the amounts that are given out currently in terms of the per capita benchmarks do not seem to be adequate to take into account food security on top of all the other dimensions of well-being that are required.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. What I'm going to do next is, just so that for questions that I didn't get to or I was unclear about, I'm going to leave this I'll leave this to the floor. So if you have a question, can you please sort of unmute your mic and ask them directly to the presenters at this stage?
Come on, ask a question.
Hello. Hi. I was thinking this might be a very radical way to solve the problem, but necessities like rice and noodles should not be subject to taxation. And maybe in a way we can offset this instead through higher taxation on luxury goods. Just what are your thoughts on this? I saw this as one of the questions on the pigeonhole. I thought it was quite interesting.
I am actually very much for a wealth tax. I don't know if that's in the same direction as what you're suggesting. So don't tax essential goods, but tax more of other items. I'm not sure whether if you just tax or don't tax specific items, but I think in general, I am in favor of a wealth tax to fund better social protection systems. I don't know if that specifically answers your question though.
Oh, yes, like in the chat, someone said don't have GST on essentials. I think that's what that meant. I'm just reading off a question in the pigeonhole. I thought it was interesting to bring up. Thank you.
Yeah, I think there is discussion on that, right? Like, why are we, because GST essentially is a tax. So yes, I do agree that we should probably not tax essentials and have a wealth tax instead.
I see Gohan's raised their hand.
Yeah, hi. Yep. I think, Stephanie, you can hear me?
Yes, I can. Hi,
Yeah.
Han.
Hi, hello. Yeah, thanks very much. I think you hit the nail by saying that I mentioned that the living wage is one of the key to this food insecurity problem. And it took many, many years until finally now, and the National Day rally that the Prime Minister mentioned about this low qualifying wage, and to a small extent, I'm not sure whether you agree that it's some acknowledgement of the need for some sort of minimum wage. They refuse to name it the minimum wage. But to what extent do you think this is going to help, or what more needs to be done to go further so that we can help to contribute to resolving part of the food insecurity problem?
Okay, so in terms of all the recent developments regarding to wage, I do think that it's important to move towards establishing a living wage. The problem though is that there's no clear indication how these benchmarks were derived is one. Who picked 1,400? What was it based on? Is it an adequate figure? Is it based on some way in which we can ensure that people who receive that amount are able to meet their minimum standards of living? So why 1,004? There's no clear, transparent explanation for how that amount was derived. And I do think that the amount is probably too low. Secondly, the LQS is not a universal minimum, not called minimum wage, because it excludes foreigners, right? I mean, we're a country where I feel like the policymakers are bending backwards to try to appease certain groups and communities with certain benchmarks that, first of all, are not transparent, quite likely inadequate, and yet also exclusionary. And it was quite ironic to me that in the same speech, there was talk about anti-discrimination, and then at the same time, the unfolding of a policy that clearly discriminates on the basis of nationality. I'm not sure how you're going to ensure that living standards increase and that occupations, I guess, you meet that kind of I feel that if you have a wage policy that discriminates on the basis of nationality, you are basically undermining the mantra of equality that's meant to accompany the ideology of implementing a living wage. I don't see how you're going to be able to kind of meet economic justice imperatives by having benchmarks that just discriminate clearly on nationality.
Thanks very much.
Plus, I don't think it's enough. Yeah.
All right, we have a next question. Robin, would you like to go ahead?
Hey, hi, Steph.
Hi, Robin.
So I have a question for you. Aside from the, getting to this point where we actually have people having a living wage and that there's less income disparity, because I think that's possibly a long way off, what kind of infrastructure changes would reflect the idea, or at least move us towards food as a right? So would you think of government playing more of a role in coordination, more food vouchers? Like how would that look like in terms of infrastructure changes?
Yeah, so this is a tough one because I'm not sure that all centralization is always a solution. Would increase government intervention? What would the government relationship look like? So there are countries like, say, in Brazil, right, where the constitution includes the right to food. And they have like a quite interesting model, at least from what I've read. Maybe someone has experience with the Brazilian model, you can share more. But they have both national and private food banks, and they kind of work in concert. So they have what researchers have called a joined up food policy, which I thought was quite interesting, meaning they understand the relationship between food insecurity and income poverty. So they work with a lot of different agencies, and food is treated as a right, and it's more holistic in that they also have nutritionists in the food bank to make sure that the food that's provided is also nutritional. They have social workers as well. So they kind of fully understand that food is just one component, right, of what is lacking. So when I read it, I was quite intrigued by that model. But of course, the overall criticism still is that there is still quite a large dependence on food aid, right? But I did think that at least in the interim period, as we move towards a lack of dependence towards food aid, I thought that was quite an interesting model where, there's both public, private, but a lot more public involvement, but with this kind of understanding that we are working towards food as a right. Yeah, and gradually, hopefully, decreasing the dependency. Yeah, in the interim period, I think that for organizations where logistically it's very hard to provide suitable, appropriate, adequate, safe food, just give vouchers or cash, yeah.
Thanks.
People need that. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
We have a question from Sin E. Please go ahead.
Hi, Grace. Based on your experience on distributing food to the community, I was just thinking what would be the best mode of distribution that could happen, because you raised that if you give food ration, it's that the food will spoil, in time, or it's not to the flavor of the person, or if you were to give dry rations, there'll be a lack of fresh food. But shopping vouchers would be the best option as what I see for now. But I also see that there will be issues where if you will have to give like vouchers, there will be seniors who are unable to walk and go supermarketing and create a certain other problems. So what we think that is the best mode of donations, because I'm sure donors will still keep coming. And how do we help minimize this gap of appropriate food distribution? Thank you.
Okay, I mean, there are quite many aspects to that question. So when you ask, when we're talking about what is the best mode, I don't think there is any best mode. It really depends on the situation. So when the COVID situation was not so precarious, more stabilized during the phase 3 period. So we actually went back to, not say went back, but we actually organized the residents to come down to collect the food rations. And before that, we actually, the local response organized their neighbors to come together and pack the rations, right? And even though the rations can actually be packed by, the supermarkets and then they deliver, but, for certain communities, when the space and the manpower allows it, we actually thought that, this packing the food rations does actually bring the local response team, and not only that, some of the members together. And when external volunteers can come and volunteer in the community, they also help pack the food rations, and it was really quite nice, in the kind of energy they generated there. Yeah. And having said that, yes, I mentioned just now that an $80 food pack is very heavy. So we came to a solution of maybe we reduce the value of the food pack, and at the same time give some supermarket vouchers together with the food pack. So it's like a combination, and when it comes to rice that is really heavy, that can be added into the food rations, whereas they can use the supermarket vouchers to buy things that they need. So that comes in, in one pack, is given to one household. So it can be a combination. And but when the situation, the COVID situation was more dangerous, and the risk of infection was higher, so we organized door-to-door distributions. That was key, right? And yeah, so I mean, in terms of the best mode of distribution, it really depends on the situation and the purpose that we are trying to achieve down there. I hope it does answer your question. If I've missed out anything, please ask.
Yes, it does. Thank you very much.
You're most welcome.
All right, I think we are down to the last minute, and I think this is a nice continuation for both Grace and Stephanie. While doing community development work and being on the ground and empowering communities to take charge of food, right, solutioning for food, how do Beyond's community workers navigate potential local politics, neighbor disputes, perceptions of bias? So how do you work through some of these challenges when doing CD?
Okay, so this is actually interesting, because I was just discussing with my colleagues yesterday. Yeah, so I mean, when in community development, we are dealing with, we are working with people, and where there's people, definitely tension is possible. Yeah, and so some of the questions that came up during the discussion that we ask ourselves is, in navigating these relationships with the local members and with the community partner, with the community members, some of the questions we ask ourselves is, do we interfere? When do we step back? Because many times we need to be able to trust the community that they have the ability and the resources to resolve their own conflicts. Also another question is, are there any, is there any assets or neighborhood leader or even local volunteer available in the community that we can tap on to manage these kind of dynamics and to navigate these kind of relationships, right? What are the values or that possibilities do I see within these tensions or dynamics that can make the community stronger and deepen the kind of relationships between members? Yeah, so yes, such difficult topics have arisen before, and we do hold very honest conversations with these local volunteers that we work with. And we invite them to share the experiences and challenges that they face as a local leader. And yes, difficult issues have surfaced. So what is important is, my colleagues share with me that when they navigate or facilitate these circles, they have to manage this the space very safely. And the intention is not to invite shame or guilt or to label, what is good or what is bad, but to provide that space for the honest conversation and appreciation. So I have to say, we don't have the answers, I don't think it's our role to solve that problem, okay, but to create that platform for the discussions. And then you may be surprised that they will come together. I mean, over time, they have some kind of collective conclusion or some way that can happen to reduce that tension and to seek that solidarity that is needed in the community. So yeah, I'm not sure if I answered that question.
Absolutely, that was so well said.
Okay.
Leading the community to, ultimately resolve, come together and work together as a collective. Very well said. Stephanie, any last words? Brief last words?
Well, I'm not a community worker, so I'm not sure if I have perspectives in relation to that specific question, which was navigating the ground while doing community work, right? So yeah, I'm not a community worker, so.
All right. Okay. With that, we have come to the end of this seminar. Can I invite all of you to please participate in the feedback poll that is on the chat message, and I will let Cleona take from here. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Stephanie, and thank you, Grace.
All right.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Grace and Stephanie, for the wonderful presentations and the discussion at the end. I see there's a lot of comments in the chat as well, and also on the Pigeonhole link. I think on top of the amazing questions, some of them which we didn't get to, there's also comments on the questions. So the Pigeonhole link will actually be open still, I think, for the next week. So if you do want to refer to it, you can refer to that anytime. Yeah, while people are doing the polls, I also have a few announcements. So please stay for this. Yeah, so just announcements on our upcoming webinars. We actually have 2 in October. Usually we have 1 per month, but we have 2 upcoming webinars. And the first one, as you saw, is the IWP ethnography team. Social lab ethnography team, which they'll be talking about the gig economy, especially particularly for food delivery riders. So do join us for that. The link is on screen. I will also send it on the chat. Hold on. Yeah, the QR code is on screen. And on the 27th, we have 2 artists, Chow and Lin, who will be presenting on The Poverty Line, which is a visual art research project. And that is on the 27th, Wednesday, same time, same place on Zoom. And yeah, do stay tuned for that. And you may also find us on Facebook, because we do put our announcements there, and you can keep up with all our publications, our events, our workshops. We are also now on LinkedIn, so connect with us there. We hope to keep in touch through LinkedIn, and also our mailing list. Yes. So again, the seminars. I'll just leave this on screen, and you may watch it as it rolls. Thank you everyone for joining us today. Thank you so much for the wonderful discussions. And thank you once again to Dr. Satveer, Stephanie, and Grace.
Thank you. Thanks, Fiona.
Sure, I'll just
Thanks, Satveer.
Thank
Bye.
you. Thank you, Stephanie.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Grace.
Feel free to log off, Savir.